Hello, I'm so excited to introduce Yael, who is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Brown University, a writer, and a mother of three. She is also the author of her latest book, Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection. She has authored also several chapters in other books as well, and written a lot of articles, especially around work, parenting, marriage, and relationship, and most importantly, tying it all back with psychology. And I am just loving everything that you put out in your newsletters and obviously your book, which we are going to talk about right now. So welcome, Yael. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
You are, yes. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for those wonderful compliments. I always like to hear them, and as we'll maybe discuss later today, it feels especially good this week to get some positive affirmation for the work that I put out. So thank you so much for the honor of having me on.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for agreeing to show up and talk to more people about your important message. As when I reached out to Yael, in my email, I told her that I am a new mom and my baby is now 10 months old, and this whole work-life balance, which we will totally reframe by the end of this podcast, was something that I just could not wrap my head around. And I am one of those crazy people who read 15 books on a topic if I'm really, really struggling or into something. And all the books around parenting and work-life balance, they were either only pro work or only pro parenting, or if they did talk about balance, it was mostly talking about what needed to change systemically, which is great. And it's not like I disagree with it, but I'm like, yeah, but I am sleep deprived with a crying newborn right now, and I have emails to get to. I can't wait for the system to change. And then maybe there's some productivity tips here or there, which again, I love them. But in that moment, that the stars have to align, right, for all the productivity tips to work. So when I found your book, and actually your book found me, I wasn't even looking for it. I was in the library with my stroller with my little baby, and she was the one who looked at it.
No way! Oh, that's so cute. I love that story.
And I followed her gaze, and I was like, oh yeah, that does look like something mommy would like. So,
oh my God, that's wonderful.
What I love about your book is that it changes the way you think. You literally have a different brain before reading and after. But I will let you talk about it. What is your motivation for writing the book? How did you get into that?
Well, first of all, Lucy, you can talk about my book as much as you want. You're making my heart inflate. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your kind words. And it's so sweet that your baby found it. But that is my greatest hope for this book, is that it creates a mindset shift for people around this idea of role balance. So if you are somebody who occupies multiple demanding roles, like work, like parenting, but I actually think that the ideas really apply to any set of roles that we inhabit. So partnership and friend and, child of aging parents, our roles have tension with one another. And the dominant way that we tend to talk about the relationship between our roles is that they are in conflict. And it's this idea of this zero-sum game, what we give to parenting gets taken away from work. Whatever resources work uses up, that kind of screws over our children or our partner. And that is, on the one hand, true. There are certain realities that we need to contend with in terms of the limitations of our finite resources. But what is so amazing to me, and this is, so when I first became a working parent and I had a baby, I was kind of going through a similar thing to what you did, which is, this is sort of the origin story of the book, but I was on postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University, where I still sit on faculty. And I was kind of this is really hard. I actually went into parenthood thinking I would have it in the bag. I loved my job. I had a healthy pregnancy. I was absolutely excited to become a parent. I had a supportive partner. My workplace is very progressive and supportive. And lo and behold, it was really, really hard. And I found myself crying every day on the commute to work and feeling just guilty that I would be at work while my child, just a couple months old, was all day with virtual strangers. And then I would go home and pick him up and at night, be playing with him, and then feel so guilty that my colleagues were probably working, and I was exhausted and wasn't reading any more articles or writing any more grants because I wanted to spend time with my baby. And so I would feel kind of ashamed of myself. And so I started thinking that, just like you, and you're totally a kindred spirit, because I'm the kind of person that tries to get my hands on everything I can find when I encounter a dilemma, because books and leading thought leaders often have good answers that can help us to navigate tricky territory. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I started reading everything that I could get my hands on from the bookstore and the library. And just like you, I became pretty disheartened because most of what's out there is pretty bleak and talks about the system changes that really do need to happen. But as you just beautifully noted, like, they're not going to happen that day when you need to respond to emails and you're crying baby, or time management techniques. And like many ambitious working people, it wasn't time management that I was really struggling with, or renegotiating division of labor in the home. And that also really didn't kind of get at what I was struggling with. And so I started to think that maybe there was a piece about this that was more psychological. And as in my own history, in my academic history, I studied marital therapy and relationship between couples, partners. And so I tend to look at things from a relational point of view. So I started diving into the academic literature, thinking, like, what is the nature of this relationship between our most demanding roles? And is it more complicated than we sometimes think about? And I discovered this entire body of literature that is about a different relationship between work and parenting. And that relationship gets captured by these words: work, family, enrichment. And it's basically the idea that our roles do conflict with each other, and they also help each other out in these very interesting ways. And it was just this light bulb for me of, okay, just like between two partners, the relationship between our roles are really complicated. And just like I do in marital therapy, maybe there are tools from social science and clinical psychology in the therapy room that can help us find ways for these two roles or other roles to exist in more collaborative, enriching ways. And so I started diving into this idea, and that is what the book is. It's sort of this new take on something that we just assume is a conflictual relationship, and really tries to create a new lens from which to think about the relationship between our roles. And it is from a work family enrichment lens. And so at the end of the day, what I'm hoping, if people read the book, is to have people transfer from a work-family conflict mindset to a work-family enrichment mindset. And I'll just say one more thing in this long monologue, which is that I never want to suggest that we can eliminate work-family conflict. Like, the roles do conflict, and that is hard. And there are tools from psychology that can help us navigate that more skillfully and compassionately with ourselves. But what we can do is we can use that conflict to our benefit. And so that's what I'm really trying to help people to do more of.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly comprehensive. I love that you looked at the whole work-life balance question as a relationship, like from the relationship lens, which makes sense because that is your background. And let me know if this is what resonates with what you were saying. It's almost like work itself is another, I mean, they're all relationships, right? It's your relationship with your baby and your relationship with your work. And so how do you manage that? And we all have different relationships in our life. So how is work any different? And I think that it's like looking at things from such a different point of view. The other thing you said is thinking of work-life fulfillment, which we will get more into, less as a from a point of conflict and more from a point of how do they synergize each other. When I was reading about that, I remember thinking that up until that point, I had thought of work-life balance as like a negotiation, which it is, but it's like the word is compromise. Like, I have to compromise to reach balance. I have to either compromise this part at work or this part at parenting. And both things I compromised made me feel guilty no matter what, which I've learned to also accept, which is another thing we'll talk about. Sorry, it's all coming out now. But when it came to fulfillment, I did not feel the sense of compromise, even though on the surface that may seem like what it is, because it's like what I have to, quote, give up actually was beneficial. There was that other side of the trade-off I did not see before. Can you elaborate more on what is work-life fulfillment? You kind of did start that thread, but let's dive deeper into that.
Yeah. So again, the simplest definition is how our roles can help each other out. And the way that I talk about it in the book, and the way that I think about it, is that there's three distinct paths that enrichment, work-family enrichment, or fulfillment, as you're calling it, can happen. The first is what I call the stress buffer effect. And that is that invariably in any of our roles, we hit rough patches where things are tough, like your baby isn't sleeping, or your toddler is really aggressive, or your boss is micromanaging you, or a project didn't go well. And what's nice about a life with multiple demanding roles is that you are forced to step away from each role. And so you have an opportunity to have different kinds of experiences outside of whatever is embodied in a primary way in the most stressful role. So, if you're having a tough time with your kid, getting a chance to go to work and have a break from that can really buffer that stress, and vice versa. The second path is what I call the transfer effect. And that's the idea that we're always doing something. We're always refining skills or learning or absorbing ourselves in something. And often what we find is that the skills that we build in one role helpfully feed back into another. So for example, you and I are doing a podcast right now. So we're refining our communication skills. We're working with technology. We're focused on getting a task done from start to finish. And all of those kinds of skills can actually help us to parent better. At some point, you're going to need to teach your baby technology. Before long, they'll be teaching you. But and you'll certainly need to teach them how to communicate and how to take projects from start to finish. Same thing goes with parenting. Like, we learn to be patient, to perspective take. And in most jobs, those kinds of skills are quite valuable. So the more that we see the ways that our roles, like when I have to step away from parenting, on the one hand, I can feel guilty. On the other hand, I can see it as an opportunity to build skills that can then be really helpful for my kids and my family. And so it shifts that guilt into something that we can really appreciate and embrace. And then the third path is something that I call the additive effect. So psychologists define happiness in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways is like pleasure and gratification, but another is having a sense of meaning and purpose. And what we know from psychological research is that when people experience a sense of having lives that are filled with greater meaning and purpose, that they tend to be more enduringly happy. They tend to have higher life satisfaction. And what's nice about that is that higher life satisfaction helps us to show up in the roles that we care about more effectively. So if I'm a happier person, I'm going to do my parenting job better. If I'm a happier person, I'm going to be more effective in my workspace. If I'm a happier person, I'm going to be a more pleasant partner to be around. So when we occupy multiple different roles, it is true that we can feel a bit more role tension, but it is also at the very same time true that we tend to have a higher sense of meaning and purpose. And what's nice too is that by spreading our existential eggs around into lots of different baskets, that when one part of our life isn't going particularly well, that we can still experience a more enduring and reliable sense of purpose because we can kind of lean on the other one. So for example, if you start to feel like, I just don't really feel like my work is meaningful, then you can really look to your parenting role and say, well, here I am, raising these small children to be kind, hardworking, thoughtful people. That's really meaningful, even if in this patch, I'm not feeling particularly connected to meaning at work. Same thing goes if, your kids are like, I don't want to do what you want to do, mom. I can sort of mitigate that sense of, I don't feel like I'm extracting much meaning and purpose in this relationship, or feeling like I'm influencing my child in these positive ways, by saying, well, I contribute to the world in other ways that feel really meaningful. And so I think, and this can kind of go with this one theory in psychology called complexification theory, that when we have more complex identities, when there's we have a part of our identity that manifests in our family life, and a part that shows up through our work, and a part that shows up through our hobbies or our spiritual community engagement, or our extended friendship circles, that we tend to have, again, that greater sense of meaning and purpose in a more stable, reliable way. So again, those three paths are the stress buffer effect, the transfer effect, and the additive effect. And in all of these ways, and I go into a lot of detail about this in the book, we can really sort of extract more thriving because of the tension between roles, not despite them, but actually because of them.
I love that. And you're right. It is work-life enrichment. I think I said something else earlier. I love the word you use about existential, putting all your existential eggs, spreading them around in different baskets. That was an amazing summary of all of that. I hope people are taking notes. I probably will re-listen to this and take notes. And the great, I think game-changing thing is just that when you look at everything as a whole system, it is like not in spite, right? You said not in spite of, but because of that we get this feeling of life enrichment. And that you tie it back to meaning, which ultimately it was calling out, like it called me out. I think when I saw that part, right? Because it actually forced me to ask, like, what does give me meaning right now? Right. And it changes actually. That's the thing. And I want it to be one thing, a constant thing, but it's not. And actually it's, I mean, I don't know. I've decided that it actually feels better when when it's changing. There's so much more flexibility, and what changes in one area of life, it does change another. I think, actually, why don't you give me an example from your life? Like, how does like an area of parenting change benefit work, or vice versa? Or you can give me an example from your book. I mean, you have a great one with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but
Oh yeah, that's like my favorite example.
Yeah.
So I talk about the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and most people know her as, this legal dynamo. And she was, from very early in her career, an incredible lawyer in training, and she married fairly young. Her husband, Marty Ginsburg, was actually just 1 year ahead of her in law school. They started out at Harvard Law. He was ahead of her. And so at some point he switched to Columbia and she followed him. And when, I can't remember exactly what year they were in law school, I think it was like her second year, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of testicular cancer. They had a young baby at like 14 months old. And so she was still in her law studies, helping him with his legal homework, taking care of her baby. They did have supports in place and somehow managed to make it work. And she wrote this really great piece in the New York Times. I think the title was something like Advice on Living Well or something like that, where she talked about how when people look at her life, they see that the role's intention might be problematic, but how she saw it was that when she would come home from a day of legal studies, that's time with her very young daughter would be what she called the pause that refreshes. She saw the opportunity to step away from her legal work and into her role as mother as an opportunity to get this recharging break. And what's really cool about that is the science on this is totally consistent with her experience, that when we sort of have this idea of like what rest is. Rest should be, sitting on the couch, eating lots of chips, binging out to Netflix. And that's a form of rest, but actually the more productive forms of rest in terms of rest that recharges our cognitive and physical batteries is actually more physically and cognitively engaging than you might think. And so we do get a break from work when we step into parenting role. And we do get a break from parenting when we step into work role, because it allows the parts of our brain and body that get activated by that role to take a break, because it's really different kinds of demands that get put on us in the various roles. So I had told Lucy this, but my kids are actually out of school this week. We're recording on a Thursday. It is the middle of the day. Typically they would be in school. And they're not, because our district is on, the teachers are on a district-wide strike, and it's been going on since this past Friday. And it's been really exhausting for me. Like, I've been on as a parent constantly because I'm more the default parent because I have a more flexible job. And I love being around my kids, but for me, that balance of work and parenting generally helps me to feel like I can sustain my energy. And I was telling Lucy that I didn't cancel this podcast because for me, this actually is a nice break from parenting to be able to talk about things that really light me up. And I certainly get lit up by all sorts of things that I get to talk about with my kids who are, they're 7, 11, and 13. So they're great conversationalists, but they don't want to talk about work family enrichment, which is fine. But for me and for lots of parents, and I even remember this and have interviewed lots of parents who have similar stories, but like when I had very young children that weren't sleeping through the night when they were babies, going to work was a nice break. And so even if I was physically tired, it offered me an opportunity to think not about whether they were going to sleep tonight, but about something else entirely. And that's a nice break that can help us to recharge. And, I think that just recognizing that it's a different kind of rest, but a really valuable one, helps us to take advantage of it more, just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg did.
Just letting that sink in a little bit. I am so impressed with how you're able to maintain your center around all of this. I know you're just
not
practicing.
Not always. You can ask
you're
my
practicing
kids.
what you're. Yeah.
I do try to practice what I preach. And what's interesting is this past week has been like a real test of that. And I'll just share, like I've had many messy moments where I've been super grumpy with my kids, and grumpy is like a generous word to myself. Like I've been not a great mom in various moments because I'm tired and I'm stressed out because the uncertainty is really killer. But it's been helpful because I do sort of have this knowledge. And so I'm able to say to my kids, like, I'm having a hard time, but like, I'm going to unhook from those thoughts and try to be present. And even though I'm stressed out and consumed by the uncertainty, it is all going to be fine. Like what the brain does is it wants to create certainty out of uncertainty. That's how human brains are wired. And so my brain is struggling with it, but also there's nothing terrible that's going to happen. It's just uncomfortable.
Yes. Yes. I'm actually quite glad that it's a very frustrating situation to be in. But selfishly, I am glad that this is happening right when we're recording this podcast, so people can actually see a real life example or like hear about a real life example that's happening. And when you said, it sounds like you are accepting, like there are parts where I am, grumpy, or more than grumpy.
Yeah, the generous word, grumpy.
Yes. And yet I know I'm not dying, and I'm making the best out of it. And I'm seeing the negative stuff that's happening, and there's a lot of that. And I'm seeing the positive side because, hey, I get to talk about work parent enrichment, which I cannot talk about with my boys. And so all of these scenes, I think there's something. If you would have, I don't know if me from like 10 years ago would really get this, because there is this mix of accepting and also like productively shifting something, right? Internally, that I think is really hard for a lot of people to kind of combine. This really is that combining of the Eastern and Western that you talk about. I don't remember where I heard it, but somewhere in your writing somewhere, where, so I did my undergrad studies in psychology as well. And I remember most of what I was taught, it was a long time ago, but it was mostly like CBT, right? Like changing your thought process. It was like a very productive way of psychotherapy, which obviously it works, right? It does have, it's evidence-based. What you had brought up, the ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We say ACT instead.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's easier to say.
I think because it sounds too much like ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, which it is not. It's
just not.
ACT. Yeah.
Yeah. So ACT, right? I've never heard of this before. It must be new. I've never heard about this before, but it integrates, it has acceptance in the title, and it integrates this acceptance and change at the same time. I know acceptance is one of the first things that you had talked about. You described this therapy, and I think that if people don't understand this part, they're going to have a less effective time implementing the rest of your book. So I would, really like to have you go deeper into what is ACT and what makes it different, I guess, than the types of conventional therapy we're used to.
Yeah, that's a super great question. And I'll just start with just even backing up to something that you said as you transitioned into this question, this sort of idea of balancing acceptance with change. And this is such an important and critical thing. But the power of acceptance is that it allows you to change more effectively. Acceptance paves the way for change. And the reason is that you're no longer fighting reality. Because once you accept reality, once you see it more clearly, you can figure out what to do with it. Right. And there's certain realities of how the human brain and the human body work. There's certain realities that you don't control whether a district goes on strike and leaves you with no childcare in a really unpredictable way. Those are not things that I have control over. But once I accept it, from there, I can figure out, what do I have the power to change? One thing I have the power to change is my attitude, but there are many other things that we can work with, that we do have influence over. But until we accept the parts that are not changeable, we are not as able to figure out what we do have the power to make headroads into and to work with. And so that is an important thing. The question of what's the difference between CBT and a treatment like acceptance and commitment therapy is a really great one too, because CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is very change focused and not as much acceptance focused, although newer modifications of CBT actually do incorporate a lot of mindfulness, because psychology researchers and practitioners have recognized more and more the power of combining these change and acceptance strategies. But CBT comes from a branch of treatments that are what we call the second wave therapy. So they focus on thoughts and behaviors. And a treatment like ACT is under the third wave of therapies, because it incorporates more acceptance-based approaches. And so whereas CBT is really focused on getting people to modify their thoughts and their actions, acceptance and commitment therapy is really focused on helping people to accept their internal experiences, their thoughts, their emotions, and even their behavioral impulses, and work on changing their relationship with the things that they can't change so that they can figure out what is more changeable. So it's really about, again, I'm a relationship researcher and relationship specialist clinically as well. So I think about everything from relationship lens. Acceptance and commitment therapy is really about shifting the way that we relate to our internal and our external world. And we focus on these 6 core processes that all converge on a core construct that I'll tell you what it is in the formal language, and then I'll explain what it is in less formal language. But we're always going for something called psychological flexibility. And the definition of that is knowing what matters most to you and being able to move your life in directions that you care about by persisting in a behavior or stopping a behavior when it matters to you to do so. So the short version of that is like showing up moment to moment in ways that reflect what matters most to you. And so it's very context dependent, because what matters most to you as a parent when your kid is 10 months old versus as a parent when your kid is 13 years old is going to be different. What matters to you, on a week that your schools are closed is going to be different than what matters to you in a week that schools are running normally. It's going to be different whether you're sick or healthy. It's going to be different based on what you're doing at work or what ambitions you have down the road. And even moment to moment, it can shift what matters to you. And so that flexibility is really important in general. And I think it's especially important for people who have lives that have multiple demanding roles, because we're often moving between things. So we have to be really flexible. Like how I show up as a mom is really different than how I show up as a therapist. And it's really different than how I show up as a podcast guest, and it's really different than how I show up as a writer. And so to be able to have that ability to kind of shift the way that I show up moment to moment, role to role, empowers me to be my most effective self in each of the roles and each of the phases of my life. And so really quickly, the 6 core processes that we teach in the therapy room when we're doing acceptance and commitment therapy are practices in mindfulness, which we define as getting in contact with the present moment. Acceptance, which you kind of talked about, but it's allowing with equanimity or easygoingness the thoughts, emotions, and experiences that you struggle with, not fighting them, but sort of accepting them, those internal experiences and even your external realities. Self is context, being aware that our mind is constantly producing thoughts and stories and feelings, but they're just products of living in a human body. Diffusion, which means being able to unhook from those internal experiences, just get a bit of perspective on them, because then you get a bit more power in deciding what to do with them. Values, and this is probably my favorite core process, but this is clarifying what matters most to you in this moment, in this role, like what would reflect the best kind of version of you that you could imagine. And having clarity in that. Often it's, and we can talk about exercises, but I often really think it's helpful to get clarity on that outside of the toughest moments so that you can use those values as a compass in the moment. And then finally, committed action. So it's really helping your values to manifest through your behavior. So it's how your values kind of show up behaviorally speaking, moment to moment.
I find that, thank you for enumerating all of that out. I find that it's really hard to get clear on what your values are if you don't do those, the first few things that you talked about. And I think that's one of the reasons why mindfulness and acceptance is so important. If you do not see reality, as you said, I like the way you said that. If you don't see reality, you don't know what to change. You may think you know, but so this is from personal experience. When I didn't accept reality and all I care about was the final destination, I would do all the wrong things to get there. And I would be going in completely the opposite direction.
Yeah.
I had no real, first of all, I didn't know where I was on the map. And then secondly, I didn't have a real compass like guiding me towards where I wanted to go.
Totally.
I think that's so important for people to know. And I love that I love that you included that in your book. And the whole basis is changing the way, like rethinking how we do that, how we view work life. And in fact, work parenting, but in fact, any role, I think, because we have way more roles beyond beyond a worker, right? Whatever our job role title is, and a parent. And they change moment to moment as well.
Totally.
Like I'm a podcast host right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the moment by moment thing. It's like, have you heard of Alison Armstrong by any chance? She is she does relationship stuff as well, and she had this, and it was in one of her things somewhere where she taught that relationships are really just moments of relating. Like she had recommended seeing it more as moments of relating. I think that's like the dictionary definition. A relationship is not like a thing, like a constant, consistent thing. And if you keep wanting it to be a thing, you're probably going to be disappointed because it's not just a fixed thing that you can, it's not predictable. And, but if you see it at moment to moment relating, then it's great because first of all, there's no baggage. And, every moment it's its own thing. And
it's a new opportunity each moment.
Yeah, yes. And I love it. I love that I can be free from baggage anytime I want. You mentioned that values is your favorite part, and it is the first chapter of your book. I think you had like 12 chapters, all awesome. But whenever I read a book, I've noticed that authors tend to put it makes sense. They put the most important thing at the front. And I think it was, your book was structured very intentionally, and values was the first chapter. What is the importance of values, or why was it the first? Why did you lead with that? Right.
I think values are important for a few reasons. One is that as a therapist, I like to know what my patients' values are, because at the end of the day, we each need to pick for ourselves what we want to stand for. So as a therapist, I'm kind of there as a guide, but I can't guide somebody I'm working with well unless I know what they want to stand for, because it's like with your partner, right? You can't force what you care about onto somebody else, but what you can do is learn about what's important to them. And as a psychologist, I have certain skills. So once I know what's important to you, then I can teach you based on what's important to you, how to get you closer to living the life that you want to live. So it helps you to know people. It also helps you. Values are something that are really critical in withstanding a difficult moment. So I'll give you an example from research, which is that when we help people to be clear on their values, and people who struggle with addiction, that they're better able to manage the impulse to use because they have something to kind of hold on to. So if I know that for me, it's really important to show up for my kid and to take care of my body so that I can be around for my grandchildren, it's going to be much easier for me to choose to drive past the liquor store as opposed to stop in it if I'm struggling with addiction. The same thing goes for parents, right? So if I know that what I want to teach my kids is to take responsibility, then when I lose my temper with them, then I have an opportunity to model that myself. So I maybe didn't do a perfect job with my temper this week, but what I did do a good job of is saying, you know what, like I'm feeling kind of short fused. I'm sorry, I lost my temper. I'll work on that. And maybe what I need to do is take more breaks, and we can each take more breaks from each other. And it sort of gives you a way to sort of guide yourself. The final thing that I'll say, and this was really highlighted in that first chapter, is sometimes there's no good choices to make, and values can offer a compass. It's sort of like if you're in the dark woods and you have no idea how to get out, it's very valuable to have a compass and to know that like north might be wiser than south. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be easier to get to the edge of the forest where there might be people to help you. But it's so much better to have a compass than not have one, because if without one, you'll just be going in circles. Yeah. And if you know what you want to stand for through a particularly thorny piece of life, then you can feel good about trying to have done your best, even if the outcome isn't exactly what you would hope for. So the story that I told in that first chapter was a really difficult decision that I had to make about whether or not to go home as my father was dying. My family lives across the country, and there was no good choice. Like if I stayed by his side, it was going to be really tough for my children, then ages like 2, 6, and 8. I was going to miss my 8-year-old turning 9. I was going to cause havoc for my mother-in-law who would come out to help schedule. My husband had a new job. It was going to cause intense stress for him. But if I left and went home to my young family, then I wasn't going to be there for my father's final days, and I wasn't going to be there for my siblings or my mother in his final stretch. And so what I did was a values clarification exercise, which is, what do I want to stand for? There's a number of ways that you can clarify this. I'll offer a few questions, and then I'll share the question that I asked myself. But some of the values clarification questions look like considering a difficult patch of life. What are you most proud of having done or stood for? How would you most like to handle it next time? What are the main ways that you'd like your children to see or remember you? That can be clarifying of like, what is it that you want to model for them? What qualities of action? If you could travel forward 30 years from now and imagine your older self looking back on your current self, what are the ways of being that would make you most proud? So those are the kinds of questions that I ask in the therapy room that help people to clarify how they most want to show up in a tough patch of life. And what I asked myself in that moment is, what do I think that my dad, who at the time was in a semi-coma, would want me to stand for? What would he want me to choose in that difficult moment? And I know my dad well enough to know that he would have wanted me to go home and be there for my oldest son who had a birthday, because he just worshiped his kids, and that would have been what he wanted. And it was not an easy decision. It's still something that I think about and kind of, wrestle with. But having the values as a guide really helped me in that dark, thorny patch of life. And I think can be really helpful for so many people when they have a tough choice to make.
Yeah, that story it really did impact me. And I'm so glad you included that story in there, because it was obviously very emotional to read it. It was a very high stakes situation that we can all put ourselves in your shoes, which helps us remember the point. And it really modeled clearly an example of how values can be used in making a difficult decision. Because I can totally see it. Anybody can say, oh, yes, I know values are important, but they don't know how to apply it. So that was something that was memorable and it actually taught very explicitly. And one thing that I wanted to say after, I actually thought about it. I had to put the book down after that and think, because I'm like, oh man. One of the things I was thinking about was basically what I would do in that same situation, right? Well, it wasn't necessarily what I would do. It is what I would do and how I would feel. And this points to another, I think, really important point about living your values, is that no matter what choice I made, something would have, not gone the way I would like in an ideal world, right? I could miss my child's birthday party. I think you also mentioned your sister was having a baby as well or something. And,
yeah, she had a baby the week before.
Yeah.
Okay. It was chaos. There were so many things going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So someone's going to get disappointed, right? Something, right? So regardless of what choice you made, by following your values, even if you did have guilt, right? Even if the guilt is still there, even if you felt bad and what the consequences, there were negative consequences, which it was going to happen either way. The fact that you made it based on your value, I think it helped me. Like if I made a choice based on my value, even if like shit hit the fan, I would still feel like, I don't know, not necessarily happy, but I would feel like a form of peace. Maybe, I don't know, the word acceptance is coming on again for some reason. That seems to be the word that keeps showing up for me. It makes it feel like I did the best I can do. And yeah, just accepting everything as it is. And ultimately, when I think back, those questions that you had asked, right? Think back to time when blah, blah, blah. When I think back to the times when I was most, just completely disappointed with what I did, regardless of what the outcome was, even when the outcome was like 90% good, I was most disappointed when I did not act in accordance with my values, of which honesty is a big one. Like whenever I was not honest with myself, especially, even if everything turned out exactly the way I wanted, oh my God, this happened. Yeah. Yeah. I did not feel good. Like I did not feel at peace with myself.
It sounds like there's a story there, Lucy. Do you want to share?
There are lots of stories. Well, there's quite a lot of story, but I think the biggest one is a story of success, which I was brought up valuing success. And by success, I mean like the point-based success system, like grades when I was in school, and money and job title, right? Like the junior, senior type job title when I was in working. But that value that I had, so it was a value, but it was not my value. And it was something that took a really long time to figure out. In retrospect, it seems so obvious, because why would it be my value if it made me feel bad whenever I achieved it? And what I mean by feel bad is that I would get that promotion and I would feel momentarily good, but then it would be momentarily good the way like a drug hit, give you a dopamine hit. And then I would just feel really, really bad for some reason. And I would not enjoy my work anymore. And, so I think that would be one of the major recurring themes in my life of not following my values. A more simpler example would be like lying to somebody to get them to make a decision that I thought was good for them. And even though I honestly thought that it was a good decision for them, the fact that I had to lie to get them to do it, I just felt so icky about it.
Yeah.
So that would be like, yeah, those are some of my examples. And
those are great examples. I love those examples. Yeah. And it's so interesting. I love both of them. And I'll just sort of pick on the honesty one, that even if you get what you want and that you think that it's good for the other person, that there's something that doesn't sit right, that doesn't feel good when we act out of line with our values. And I think that is a really common occurrence, right? That if we get ahead, but we did it in a way that it doesn't feel like who we most want to be, it doesn't feel good. And then the reverse is true, that when you do show up in line with your values, even when things don't go exactly according to plan, you sort of have that to hold on to. And I think peace is a good word and acceptance is a good word. And that's certainly the case about what happened with my father, because I did return home and he did pass away the next day. And I wish I had known that. I wish I had stayed. A part of me wishes that I had stayed one more day. But whenever I have that fleeting thought, I'm able to return to my value, to reconnect to it and say, you know what? I did what I thought would best represent the thing that was important to my dad. That's what I stood for. And I feel that sense of I did the best I could by the person who I idolized most in this world. And I think he would have been proud.
Yeah.
And that doesn't undo the sadness. And so I think that's where the self-compassion piece comes in, which is, nobody does this thing of life perfectly. Nobody does these roles that are so demanding perfectly. And having the ability to sort of give yourself space to be imperfect in a loving, kind way gives you more space to learn and grow and do better the next time than compared to if you're very self-critical. And so that's something I also talk a lot about in my book.
Yeah. Yeah, this thinking back to like, oh, had I just known, maybe I would have done something differently. I love that you are like that you acknowledge those thoughts, right? And it's a very valid thought. And but you did what you did. And and you did it for because you did it for the right you did it for the right reasons according to your values and your dad's values. And I love that you took that into consideration. When I was saying the story about this person that I lied to them to get them to do something that I thought was good for them, essentially they weren't in a good relationship, I guess, is the best way of saying it, right? But I didn't consider what their values were. Like, would what I thought was good for them actually have been different if I had known what their values were? Maybe. I actually don't know. I don't know. And that is something I am thinking about now. Yeah. But it did give me a good lesson because the bad feeling that came afterwards was not a good feeling. And as for, I think, I don't know, it just occurred to me like, and there are also examples where I did follow my values. And another one of my values is freedom. I actually, it was so much easier to implement this kind of after I got clear on that. In my own business, I sometimes I hire people and I sometimes have to fire them, right? We're a small business, and when you're in a small business, you can't, like, it grows at a certain pace where not everybody is a good fit that they were a year ago or something like that. And so, the reason why it was freedom is because I was actually thinking, if we're both stuck in roles, like if this person was stuck in a role that they were clearly very stressed out about and weren't good at anymore, then I'd rather free them to find something that actually they would like to do. And I felt really bad doing it. When I had the conversation, ultimately, I mean, and they took it really well, right? But ultimately, I think, like making these making these terrible, hard decisions. I'm just thinking about how they were feeling because they didn't feel good about it, but I think now they're doing okay. But ultimately, kind of making these decisions, right? It's like you still keep thinking about it sometime, and but
right,
I felt like I did the right thing. So
yeah. And I think you're picking up on something else that's really important, which is that sometimes good decisions don't feel good. Sometimes the things that represent how we most want to show up in the world feel downright rotten.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I mean, that's a part of life too. And that, again, when we can connect to a reason to stand for whatever it is that we stood for, that it's much easier to tolerate. We can almost like transcend those feelings of discomfort, which is not to say that it doesn't feel uncomfortable. It does, but it sort of helps us withstand it a bit more skillfully. And I'll also just give another point that you're sort of alluding to, which is that we can do the exact same thing. Like the behavior can be identical and it can be value aligned or not value aligned. And when it's value aligned, it's going to ultimately work better for us. And there's actually a really nice metaphor for this that John Forsyth, who is a major ACT researcher and teacher, he has some great books. And I can't remember if he does it in his TED Talk. He has a TED Talk if people want to check it out. But he gives this really great metaphor of, imagine that you're at the gym and you see two people who've just done an hour-long run on the treadmill, both running full out. And then afterwards you interview each of them and you say, why did you do that run? And the first one says to you, well, I ate really badly last night, so I was forcing myself to get rid of all the calories and, try to know that like I'll have to punish myself if I do that again. Right. So they were doing it not for a value aligned reason, but sort of like as a self-punishment. Whereas the other person, when you interview them, they say, it's really important to me to maintain a healthy body. And like, I'm trying to honor this body that belongs to me and give it as many chances as I can to thrive. And you can kind of see that, like, even as you hear the story, like in your own body, you feel differently. Like the first story kind of makes you feel a little gross and sad. And the second story helps you to feel like, more open and embracing of even the discomfort of going for an hour-long run on a treadmill. So it can be the exact same behavior, but when it's value aligned, it often feels better, even if there is discomfort that also comes along with the ride.
That is, yep, very, very well said, Yael. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure having you. What let's see. I usually end these by asking my guests, what is something like what are you working on right now that you're interested in, or what is something that that is coming up maybe in the future that you'd like to share?
Well, weekly I work on a newsletter called Relational Rifts, and I hope people check it out. It's all about the science of relationship and relationships and how we can use that science to help us navigate our roles, our relationships with people, our partners and our kids more skillfully, but also the relationship between our roles and our relationship with our thoughts and our feelings. Again, because I see everything through a relational lens. I do talk a lot about the relationships between people in the newsletter. And then I'm also working on a book right now that's about misunderstandings. So it's really early in the process, but I'm really excited about it. So.
I'm really excited too. What is so important about studying relationships? Like, what got you into all of this?
I don't know. I've always been like a very relationally curious person from very early on.
Yeah.
I guess if I had to craft a story about it, it would be because I was raised by my father, who I've mentioned many times before, was raised in Israel. So people may be familiar with the name Yael. It is an Israeli name, although I was raised in the States. Both my parents are Israeli, and my father was raised in a community called a kibbutz in a fairly unusual way. He was raised apart from his parents in a children's house. And so he was sort of relationally unique in the way that he related to people as a result of his upbringing. And so I think I just really became curious about the relationship between parents and children and between partners, in part because of how he showed up and also because the visiting the kibbutz was such a regular part of my childhood. And so I think that was a part of it. And also I think just temperamentally, I'm a very relationally oriented person. I think that's why. And I love science. And I think anytime you can use science to improve the parts of life that are most important, and relationships, we know without question, are like the key to people's well-being. So for me, relational science is like this superpower. And I think it's so important to share it. And there's so many areas of social science that don't get out to non-academic audiences, and this is one of them. And so my mission is to be able to translate a lot of that relationship science to people that can benefit from it.
Love it. And I love your newsletter, and everybody should sign up for Relational Rifts. I love I love the title as well.
Thank you.
Yes. So Yael, where can people find you and your work?
Well, definitely go to Substack and check out Relational Rifts. And thank you, Lucy, for the shout out to that and the endorsement of it. And then I am a little bit on social media on Instagram. So you can find me at Dr. Yael Schonbrun, and a little bit on LinkedIn. And then otherwise, I hope people pick up the book. And I love hearing from people. So if you want to communicate via social media or email, I always enjoy that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. What a fun conversation.